Hello.
Hello.
Yay. Welcome, Amanda Wells. So this is
Thank you.
NiCHE Conversations, and I am Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I'm joined by Amanda Wells. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Amanda. I'm a PhD student with the University of Newcastle in Australia, which is far away from me on the East Coast.
Mhm.
I'm actually in South Australia at the moment on NiCHE country, which is otherwise known as the Barossa Valley, which wine lovers may have heard of even beyond Australia, but it's a lovely part of the world. And I'm
Awesome.
researching, for my PhD, I'm researching the environmental history of citrus growing in the Riverland of South Australia, which is
Mhm.
not too far from me nowadays.
Awesome. So when was it? Back in October, I think on Halloween. Yeah, on Halloween we published your essay, which was part of the Ghost Light Folkloric Non-Humanity on the Environmental Stage series. And this is a series that our editor, Caroline Evans Abbott, who is in the audience today, edited. And your piece was a Place of Spirits, Persistence and Deep Time Entanglements in Colonized Place. And that's what we're going to be chatting a little bit more about today. Um, and first off, because, you're in Australia and, most of our readers are in North America, we've got a global reach, obviously, but most of our readers are not in Australia. So I thought we'd talk about first the region that you're writing about with it, which is Chowla. So how would you describe Chowla? Where is it? How would you describe it to someone who isn't familiar with the region?
Yeah, so it's a massive property actually that's in the sort of central part of South Australia. So there's a really big river, one of the largest rivers in the world actually, called the River Murray, which comes from the east coast down into South Australia, and it's the only main freshwater source that freshwater river that South Australia has. So it's quite important to us in South Australia. But it comes through into South Australia in a semi-arid part of the state, which is most of the state, but it comes through, and in that part, we now call that part the Riverland, and that part of the world only gets about, on average, 10 inches of rain a year, so it's quite dry. A
Mhm.
couple of years ago, I asked someone, and they only had about 1 inch of rain that whole year, so it's a bit of a precarious place to try and
Yeah.
do horticulture, if not for the river.
Mhm.
So Chowler itself, they it was established more as a pastoral station, a place to produce wool in the 19th century. Um, and it was originally called, well, it was originally called a lot of things, but the station was called Bookmark, and then it was separated into Calpram and Chowler. And Chowler has remained in the same family since I think about the 1870s. And they still produce wool there. And their homestead there, the station house, is right next to where the orangery that I discussed in that essay is still. Oh, there's an ant on my phone. Hello, more than human world. There we
Hello. Welcome. Um, cool. Yeah, I have a fascination with Australia, which is when I was a child, I was obsessed with the thorn birds. Have you heard of this?
Yes,
Yeah. So I read
that's so
everything I
interesting.
could about Australia because I was obsessed with this novel and miniseries from the 80s. Anyways, that's an aside, but that's just my personal.
Oh, I think I
Um,
said in an email to you that I've also been really interested in Canada
yeah.
for a long time, and I was captured by the place Saskatoon because it's such an interesting word. And my mother was a geographer when she was at university, and so I would always get her to say Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, just because it sounds so nice.
Yeah, it is. It's a exceptionally cool
Mm,
name.
mm.
And no, like almost no one, like when I moved here, because I'm American, I'm from the States. So when I originally moved here, I'm moving to Saskatoon. And people were like, that doesn't sound real. Okay, see you. And I never
Yeah,
returned.
yeah.
um, yeah, so you mentioned it, but a lot of this piece focuses on an orangery.
Mhm.
So I thought in the next part of our little chat, we could talk about, what is the historical role of this orchard in this region?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Chowla sort of sits at the intersection of a lot of themes and I want to say tropes in Australian history to do with colonisation and the use of land and making place. So obviously to start, it's on Arurung country, which is the indigenous group from that part of Australia. They're part of the broader Meru Nation, and colonizers came through from about the 1830s and dispossessed Arurung people of their lands. Obviously, there's been a lot of work done by historians and archaeologists actually sort of rebuilding the story of Arurung continuing connection to land, especially on places like Chowla and Kalparam, where people maintained work, even though they didn't have possession of their sovereign lands. But the orangery itself was established to sort of connect the station with what was happening in other parts of the colonized region. The Chaffee brothers had come over from California in the 1880s to establish some irrigation colonies at the behest of Australian governments to try and develop these sort of more arid parts of Australia to make them economically viable and settle them, and all those sorts of colonial and civilizational sort of big thinking imperial ideas. But that sort of, it did take off. It did quite well despite some troubles with recessions and droughts and things that are inherent to this kind of landscape. And the other connection with Canada is that the Chaffee brothers, of course, were from Ontario. So there's lots of place names and things that connect this part of the world to both California and to Canada. So that's a neat through link that I didn't think through when I applied to write this essay. But yeah, I think it's interesting to trace this orangery as well, because as it comes into the 20th century, you can see themes of agricultural use of land, ownership and negotiating rights to water, which is a hot topic in that part of the world and many parts of the world, but especially the arid parts of the world. And contested ownership. And then you come into the 1950s, and this is something that I found with more detail after I'd written the essay, actually, after speaking with the current managers of the property, that in 1956, the biggest flood of last century happened along the Murray, and it flooded the orangery and killed all of the trees there. And this is why, well, part of the reason why, if you look at the land now, there's no trace of that orangery except that there's a vineyard there now. And there's certainly no trace of Indigenous or settler burial sites there now. It was wiped away by this massive environmental event. It still leaves its traces. And it's current now as well, because there's a really big flood happening along that river at the moment. It's still peaking in certain places. So it's one of those cool things about history, is that you can sort of trace and connect things together, even though it doesn't seem like, it's not a big orangery, especially in terms of that region. It's only like the size of a paddock sort of thing. It's not acres and acres of oranges. Yeah. It was just a small enterprise as part of this larger station connecting it to the region.
Yeah, I love when we can look at these small pieces of history that actually are not small at all. Like, it's just, I love the connections of everything, and I also appreciate, I love that we're including more like non-North American history on our site, because it's just illustrative of, how, colonialism may look, the details might be slightly different, in Australia or in India or in the US, etc. But, the main system, the frameworks are, are basically the same everywhere, right? The same forces are kind of reaching their fingers out everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just, reading the different ways that plays out, and the ways that it's similar and ways that it's different, is so valuable. And I really appreciated this piece because of that. Um, yeah. So you frame this piece at the beginning and the end, as well as in the title, with this idea of deep time. And this is something that I really haven't grappled a lot with my own work, but I like the way that you included it. So I thought we could wrap up today just kind of talking about um, your own use of deep time and how you see, looking at these broader expanses of time and geological forces, etc. What does that reveal about human history?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that I've loved most about coming back to history. I studied it in my undergrad um, for a while, but I did anthropology. That was my major. That
Mm-hmm.
was what I finished with. But coming back to history now, 15, 20 years later, there's so much more. Firstly, anthropologically, there's a lot of things that have been moved from disciplines across into history. So I love that. But the incorporation of deep time and the true appreciation of what Indigenous perspectives bring to deep time. And
Mm-hmm.
we're so lucky in Australia that we have that human connection that we can tie in with these geological timescales. It brings stories to life. But for me and in my work, I find deep time is one of those ways that you can sort of decenter the Western perspective on things and sort of expand that historical imagination away from what we can know in documentary evidence. Because my research for my PhD is very limited from 1948 to 1970. So that's not really deep time. That's
Right.
very recent. Um, my parents were alive for most of that period, so it's not a long time
Yeah.
ago. But through the soil and through place names, through the sovereign owners of the land that I'm talking about, these landscapes extend well beyond that period of time, and it allows us to think more broadly and more imaginatively about the type of histories that we can tell, even when we feel relatively restricted by what our discipline might tell us is possible. And I love that the more recent environmental history first, but then we've got multi-species history and deep time history and all those sorts of things that just allow us to expand what's possible in terms of making historical knowledge. So it's probably a little meta rather than what it directly applies to for this essay, but I think that's how I think of it and how useful it can be for historical stories.
I love that. I really like that, and I like the challenge of it, and that yeah, it's getting me thinking about, like the different angles that I could be looking at things, or how I should be, not should be, but how I can, yeah, just expand my own viewpoint on things, and yeah, I just appreciate things that do that. So, um,
Yeah, I love that opportunity we have when we talk about environmental history. There's always some element of things that were formed millennia ago. The soil is
yeah,
it's very difficult to build up soil. It takes thousands of years to get topsoil. So you know that you've got at least that element of
yeah,
deep time present in any landscape that you're looking at. So
yeah,
I think it's a wonderful opportunity.
yeah, yeah. Or just thinking like energy history, fossil
Mm-hmm.
fuels are very deep time, right? Just like
Yes.
deep time surfaced, um,
Yeah.
and processed. Anyways, that's cool. Anyways, we could talk about that forever, but I guess I'll leave it there. But I just want to encourage everyone to check out this piece. You also have a piece of artwork as the feature image, which it's gorgeous. Uh, always an applause for those of us with multi-talents and getting to
Thank
see
you.
them. And, you know, we're always just kind of droning on in our essays. So it's always nice to see those little sparks of humanity that, you know, make us all different and, you know, bring different things to the table and stuff. So I
Yeah.
love that piece of art.
Hmm. Ties things together as
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
thinking about things differently. Because you can say
Mm,
some things in art and in more creative ways that you can't say historically.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, I think those two things work well together. And we should work more with um,
Mm, yeah,
creative researchers. So
yes. And yeah, you know, I haven't been able to do it yet, but I technically left academia so that I could be more creative. So here's the challenge. Fight the forces from without or within, whichever works for best for everyone.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to thank you for joining me today, and Amanda, that was really nice. I had a great time talking with you.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.